Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today, inshallah, we'll talk about seedless vascular plants. If you recall, we had divided the plant kingdom into two broad categories: plants that produce seeds and plants that did not produce seed, or seedless plants. Among seedless plants, we had further divided the category into two: non-vascular and vascular plants. Seedless non-vascular plants are the most basic of plants, and seedless vascular plants are slightly more advanced. They don't produce seeds, but they have vascular systems. If you recall, as a review, we had taken these three categories of plants as representatives of the seedless non-vascular categories. We had talked about the bryophytes, the mosses before. We had also talked about the entocerophytes, the hornworts, and also the hepaticophytes, the liverworts. Today, inshallah, we shall talk about the seedless vascular plants, and among these four special categories. We shall spend most of our time talking about the ferns, or the Pterophytas. Thereafter, we shall briefly mention the club mosses, or the LYCOPHYTAs, the horsetails, the Arthrophyta, and the whisk-fern, or the Psilophyta, one of the most ancient of plants. They kind of look like these. Most people are familiar with ferns, therefore we shall focus most of our attention on these plants. Club mosses and horsetails, you can also probably find them occasionally here and there. The whisk-ferns was also mentioned briefly in the end. Before we begin, if we also recall, in the seedless non-vascular plant, the most basic of plants, it was the gametophyte generation that dominated. And in the plants that we shall talk about today, the seedless vascular plants, the slightly more advanced plants, it was the diploid sporophyte generation that dominates. So let's talk about the ferns. The ferns, or the phylum Pterophyta, they appeared some 375 million years ago. Ancient ferns apparently grew very, very tall and formed large forests. Now here are some examples of some current ferns. This is a bird nest fern on the left, and the clover fern, an aquatic plant whose roots grow underground. This is a tropical fern, quite beautiful, and they can get quite large. Although most common in tropics, ferns can grow in most environments. This is the basic structure of a fern. The leaf of a fern is called a frond, and each frond is made of many, many pinnae. These finger-like projections from the main stem of the plant are the rachis. Now you must understand that these plants are vascular plants. In other words, water and minerals flows through these plants through the tiny veins and arteries, so to speak. The plant is grounded with the rhizome, which has root-like structures that anchor the plant into the ground. If you were to turn over the frond, you will see this tiny little structure on the undersurface on each of these pinnae. Like other plants, ferns also practice alternation of generation. If you recall, plants spend their time between the gametophyte and the sporophyte generation. It is the gametophyte generation that produces gametes, which are haploid, and when gametes fuse, a diploid zygote is formed. And the diploid zygote grows into the sporophyte, which is diploid. Some part of the sporophyte specializes into structures that produce spores. This process occurs by meiosis, and the spores that are produced by these diploid sporophyte are haploid. And these haploid spores give rise to a new generation of gametophytes. So let's look at the life cycle of ferns in a little bit more detail. What you see over here is a mature haploid gametophyte. This is a very small structure, and this structure has both male and female parts. The male part is called the antheridium, and it produces the sperms. And the female part is called the archegonium, which produces the egg. This is very similar to the life cycle of mosses that we have seen before. In fact, the terminology is the same. When it rains, it allows the sperms to swim to the egg, and fertilization occurs. The fertilization results in a diploid zygote. And it is this zygote that grows into a new diploid sporophyte. Now, if you recall, it is the sporophyte generation that dominates, and majority of the plants, these fronds, are sporophyte. These are mature sporophytes. And on the undersurface of these sporophytes are sporangium, those tiny structures that produce spores. This process occurs by meiosis, and it takes a diploid nuclei and converts them into multiple haploid spores. Spores are then released, and each spore then, in optimal circumstances, grows into a new haploid gametophyte, and the cycle continues. Again, as I stated, The majority of the plant is sporophyte. In other words, when you look at a fern, the majority of it is diploid. All those fronds are diploid structures, and on the undersurface of those plants are the spore-producing sporangium. Now we shall talk about the rest of this category of plants. Second on the list is the LYCOPHYTA, or the club mosses. They're small things now, less than 25 centimeters in height, but they were dominant vegetation in the Paleozoic era. They're apparently as tall as 30 meters high. They are very, very, very tall trees. Nowadays, these are responsible for the large coal deposits that are present underground. If you forgot where the Paleozoic era was, the Paleozoic era starts at the end of the Precambrian era. LYCOPHYTA, the club mosses, and similar spike mosses, their reproductive structures look like clubs, and that's why they're called clubs. A single vein-like structure runs through each leaf. Sometimes these are also called ground pines, because of their kind of resemblance to pine trees. Third up on the list are the horsetails, or the Arthrophytas. Modern horsetails are small, but the fossils are as big as trees, so these plants used to be quite big at one time. Horsetails are called horsetails, obviously because they look like horsetails. Apparently only some 15 species of these are left. They're usually found in marshes, and they contain silica. Their hollow stems appears jointed like this, although it's not quite jointed, and there's scaly-like leaves at these joints. They end in strobili, which are these structures over here, and strobili produce spores. Singular of strobili is strobulus, and if you look at a strobulus, it is a spore-producing factory. Each one of these tiny things, when it's magnified, reveals thousands of spores that are growing inside. These spores, just like with the ferns, are dispersed in surrounding areas, and they grow into the gametophyte generation. And the gametophytes, the Antheridia and the Archegonia, produce the gametes. The last category is the Psilophytas, or the whisk-ferns. These are some of the most ancient of plants, and they have a very basic vascular system. But nevertheless, they have a vascular system. They have tiny buds, which are sporangia-producing structures. They are anchored to the ground like mosses with rhizomes. And that concludes our brief survey of the seedless yet vascular plants. Assalamu alaikum.